She begged to trade her baby for cornmeal, and the rancher said nothing. Then he took both. In the dead of winter, 1874, a desperate young mother stumbles through a snowstorm, clutching her dying child. She knocks on the door of a secluded ranch deep in the New Mexico highlands, only to be met by a man with eyes as cold as the frost on his window pane. But this story isn't about him. It's about what happened next. It's a story of survival, sacrifice, and a justice born from blood and ash. If you're drawn to powerful frontier tales filled with twists you won't see coming, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next ride. The snow had swallowed the trail long before Ruth Galloway dared admit she was lost. Her boots crunched through a crust of white so thick it had erased the road, the fence, even the memory of a path. The wind howled like it wanted to peel the skin from her bones, and the sky above looked bruised. A nasty purple stretched taut over the vast, uncaring wilderness. She didn't remember how long she'd been walking. Hours, days. The baby in her arms, 5-month-old Nellie, hadn't cried in over an hour. That silence, more than the cold or the gnawing hunger in her belly, chilled Ruth to her very soul. She cradled the child against her chest, the thin cotton sling a pathetic defense against the biting cold. Her own coat was little more than a farm dress and a shawl, once cream-colored, now a stiff, frozen testament to her desperation. Her lips were cracked, her breath was ragged, her fingers were numb and useless. And yet she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, not with Nellie's breath so faint against her collarbone, as if life itself were exhaling its very last. Then, like a cruel mirage rising from the endless white, she saw it, a ranch house, low and squat, with a plume of smoke curling from a stone chimney. A miracle. She stumbled forward, her knees nearly buckling on the gentle slope leading to the porch. One hand gripped the icy banister while the other shielded Nellie. Ruth's voice trembled as she knocked, a feeble sound immediately swallowed by the wind. She knocked again, harder this time, her knuckles raw against the frozen wood. Nothing. She pressed her forehead to the door, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Please, just some cornmeal. Please, God, just a little. When the door finally creaked open, she almost collapsed in relief. The man who filled the doorway was a wall of a man, his face flushed from the heat of the fire behind him. He had a thick beard, and his eyes were small and greedy. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the bundle in her arms. He wasn't kind, but he was warm. Ruth's voice broke. Please, she whispered, the word a puff of white in the frigid air. Just a little cornmeal. I have nothing left, but I can make milk if I eat. She hasn't eaten in 2 days. She's so cold. The rancher said nothing. He just stared, his expression unreadable. He looked from Ruth's desperate face to the baby's still form. A long, quiet moment passed. A whole lifetime lived in the space between heartbeats. Then wordlessly, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. The warmth that hit her was so sudden, so absolute, that the world tilted on its axis. She staggered, her knees finally giving way. The rancher caught her, not gently but firmly, his grip like iron on her arm. He steered her toward a rough-hewn chair by the massive fireplace. He took the sack of cornmeal she had pointed to on his shelf. It was a full sack, more than she could have dreamed of. He hefted it, his eyes glinting in the firelight. Then he looked at Nellie. He extended his arms. The baby, he grunted his first words. For the cornmeal. Ruth recoiled, pulling Nellie tighter against her chest. No, she breathed. No, you don't understand. I just need a little. I'll work. I'll do anything. The rancher's face hardened. He set the cornmeal down on the table with a heavy thud. He took a step toward her. His eyes were no longer just greedy. They were dead. Empty. The baby, he repeated, his voice flat. Or you both freeze outside my door. Your choice. He wasn't offering a trade. He was passing a sentence. But before Ruth could scream, before she could run, a shadow fell across the doorway. Another man stood there. Taller, leaner, his skin the color of weathered bronze. His black hair fell in a loose braid over one shoulder. He was Apache, and he had seen everything. The second man moved with a speed that was terrifying. It wasn't human. One moment he was in the doorway, The next he was across the room. He didn't make a sound. The rancher turned, his face a mask of shock, just as the Apache's hand shot out, grabbing the front of his shirt. The rancher was a big man, but the stranger lifted him with one arm as if he weighed nothing. The Apache's other hand held a knife, its obsidian blade dark and hungry in the firelight. He pressed it to the rancher's throat. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The air crackled with a violence older than the mountains. The rancher's eyes went wide with terror. He dropped the sack of cornmeal. The Apache man looked at Ruth, then at the baby. His eyes, the color of smoldering ash, held a flicker of something ancient, something that looked like recognition. He gave the rancher a slight shake, a silent command. The rancher scrambled backward, tripping over a stool, his bravado gone, replaced by a primal fear. The Apache man turned his back on him completely. He walked toward Ruth. He reached down, his large hand surprisingly gentle, and picked up the fallen sack of cornmeal. He offered it to her. Ruth was frozen, caught between two different kinds of fear. This man had just saved her, but he was just as frightening as the man he'd saved her from. She stared at him, clutching Nellie, unable to move. The Apache man didn't press her. He simply set the cornmeal beside her chair. Then he looked at Nellie again. He reached out, not for the child, but for the thin blanket she was wrapped in. He touched the fabric, his fingers tracing the cheap cotton. He looked back at Ruth, and his expression softened for just a fraction of a second. He turned, grabbed a thick wolf pelt blanket from a hook by the door, and draped it over Ruth's shoulders. The weight of it was a comfort, a shield. He then scooped Nellie, cradle and all, into one arm. His movements were sure, practiced. He examined the infant's pale face, her lips tinged with blue. He placed a hand on her chest, feeling for the faint flutter of life. Then he turned and walked out the door, back into the swirling snow with her baby. Ruth screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from the depths of her soul. She scrambled to her feet, the wolf pelt falling to the floor, and plunged after him into the blizzard. "Wait, please! Where are you going?" The wind snatched the words from her mouth. The rancher, still cowering by the fire, just watched her go, a wicked smile spreading across his face. Outside, the world was a vortex of white. The Apache man was already a fading silhouette, moving through the storm with an unnatural ease. Ruth stumbled after him, her boots sinking deep into the snow, her lungs burning with the icy air. She kept him in her sights, a dark ghost against the blinding white. He wasn't moving away from her, she realized. He was leading her. He moved toward a line of pines into a part of the woods where the wind wasn't so vicious. And there, tucked into a hollow, almost invisible against the snow-dusted trees, was another cabin, a smaller one. Smoke curled from its chimney. This was his home. He had brought her to his home. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, still holding Nellie. Ruth followed, collapsing just inside the doorway, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Warmth enveloped her, a different kind of warmth than the rancher's suffocating heat. This was a gentle, steady warmth from a small, well-tended fire. The cabin was clean, neat. Everything had its place. Iron pots, woven baskets, tools arranged with a respect for order and survival. But there were no signs of a woman's presence. No embroidery, no soft linens. Instead, the walls were adorned with bones, feathers, and stones carved with symbols she didn't recognize. A large, solemn dream catcher hung by the single window, its threads stirring in the draft. An Apache medicine bag lay on a shelf above the hearth. This was a place of spirits, a place of deep memory. The man placed Nellie in her arms again, then moved to stoke the flames. Only then did she truly look at him. He hadn't spoken a single word. He hadn't even made a sound. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to a cabinet, opened it, and returned with a small tin of his own cornmeal. He poured some into a kettle of water already hanging over the fire. He was making her food. He had his own food. He didn't need the rancher's. He hadn't saved her for the cornmeal. He had saved her for another reason, one she couldn't begin to understand. He sat across from her, not too close, but close enough to be a sentinel, a guardian. The silence between them was thick, heavy, but not menacing. It was a watchful silence, a patient silence. As she ate the warm porridge, feeling life seep back into her limbs, she watched him. And that's when she saw it. A series of faint white scars that traced the line of his jaw, disappearing into his hairline. They were old scars, deliberate scars, as if someone had tried to carve the words right out of his mouth. The morning came slowly, filtered through snow-draped pine and the smoke-gray light of a sky too weary to shine. Ruth stirred beside the hearth, her arms wrapped around Nellie, who now slept more peacefully than she had in days. The warmth in the cabin lingered like a held breath. She blinked, her gaze drawn to the far end of the room. The Apache man, Elias Red Elk, knelt beside the fire. He was grinding something in a small stone bowl, his bare arms flexing with the rhythmic motion. There was a precision in his hands, not haste, as he added the powdered root to a basin of warm water. He dipped a cloth into the mixture, then wrung it out with care. Ruth watched, silent, as he returned to her side. Still no words. He gently took Nellie from her arms, laying the child on a soft blanket near the fire. With movements learned through generations of practice, he placed the warm cloth against the baby's tiny chest. He removed it, pressed again, a rotation of poultices warmed by the embers. He moved to the hearth and brought back smooth, dark stones, rounded by river and time. He set them into the coals, letting them heat while he arranged a mix of dried herbs in a shallow clay bowl. Sweetgrass, sage, and something earthy and wild that Ruth didn't recognize. When the stones were ready, he lifted them with tongs and dropped them into the bowl. The herbs smoked instantly, fragrant tendrils curling into the air. He wafted the smoke over Nellie's small body with a fan of hawk feathers tied together at the stem. Ruth watched, transfixed. The baby's chest, which had been rattling with a shallow, labored rhythm, began to rise and fall more evenly. A faint touch of pink returned to her cheeks. This man wasn't just a survivor, he was a healer. He knew the secrets of the earth, the language of root and leaf. She finally found her voice. "How do you know what to do?" she whispered. He didn't answer, but his eyes met hers. They weren't cold or evasive. They were just steady. It was then, in the clear morning light, that Ruth noticed it again. The way his jawline didn't move fully when he breathed. Something about it was stiff, slightly off, as if the bone beneath had been broken and set wrong. A memory surfaced, a piece of cruel town gossip she'd overheard months ago. A name, Elias Red Elk, whispered with a mixture of fear and contempt. Refused to speak, a merchant had sneered, bit his own tongue off to protect the heathens. But now seeing him, seeing the deliberate care in his hands, she knew that wasn't the truth. That was a story told by guilty men. The real story was etched on his face. When Elias turned to fetch more herbs, she stood and followed. He didn't stop her when she approached the small wooden box on a shelf near his sleeping roll. It wasn't locked. She lifted the lid. Inside were folded pieces of cloth, a bundle of root shavings, and a journal, half written in English, half in symbols. And beneath it all, a folded, yellowed letter. She unfolded it carefully. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. He would not betray the village. Even as they broke his face, he did not scream. We owe him more than thanks. We owe him silence. Ruth stared at the words, her blood running cold. She looked at Elias, who had paused and was now watching her. Your jaw, she murmured, the words catching in her throat. They broke it, didn't they? He didn't nod, but she saw the truth in the way his shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly, in the flicker of ancient pain that crossed his features. They had demanded to know where the rest of his people had gone, where they had hidden. Elias had said nothing, and for that loyalty they shattered his jaw, leaving him in a world of enforced silence. She finally understood. His silence wasn't a choice he made every day. It was a sentence handed down to him. It was his shield, his protest, his living memorial. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. You gave them your silence, and now you live in it. His gaze held hers, and in that long, wordless moment, an understanding passed between them, an alliance forged not from conversation, but from shared damage. He had been broken by the world. She had been broken by it too. He turned back to Nellie, who now cooed softly in her sleep. He stroked her forehead with a single, gentle finger, then placed another warm stone beneath her blanket. Ruth whispered, "Thank you." This time, when his eyes met hers, they had softened. And though he did not speak, she heard everything she needed to know. But as she watched him, she noticed something else. Tucked into the corner of the wooden box was another, smaller object, a silver locket, tarnished with age. It didn't look like it belonged to him. It looked like something a white woman would wear. With trembling hands, she picked it up. She opened the clasp. Inside, there was a tiny, faded portrait. It was a picture of a woman with red hair and green eyes. A woman who looked hauntingly, impossibly like her. Far beyond the pine-cloaked hills where Ruth and Elias sheltered, the town of Dry Creek simmered beneath a pale winter sun. The snow had begun to crust along the rooftops, its brilliance dulled by soot and suspicion. At the pulpit of the old chapel on Main Street, Reverend Josiah Price delivered fire with every word from his thin, cracked lips. He was a man made of bones and rage, cloaked in black wool and sanctimony. His hair was the color of ash, slicked back with lard, and his eyes held the permanent, unwavering gleam of conviction. A conviction that rarely bent to mercy. Behind him, nailed above the altar, was a wooden cross so large and jagged it looked more like an instrument of torture than a symbol of peace. This valley, he preached, his voice rising like a whip crack, has suffered the stain of wickedness. A woman, Ruth Galloway, has spat upon her holy vows, bewitched her husband into madness, and fled with his child into the jaws of heathen land. He paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. She must be found. The child must be saved. The land must be cleansed. The pews groaned as the townsfolk shifted uncomfortably. They had heard the whispers, whispers of a rope, of a man's boots swinging in the barn rafters, of Ruth's pale, haunted face disappearing into the woods with only a baby in a sack of cloth. But truth in Dry Creek was a malleable thing, often shaped by who shouted it loudest, and Josiah Price shouted louder than God. The next morning he mounted his horse, an old black gelding named Redemption, and rode out with 2 men at his side. Harlan Briggs, a heavy-set brute with fists like anvils and a nose broken too many times to count, never asked why, only how hard. On the other side rode Seth Milner, wiry and whip-smart, with the face of a weasel and a tongue to match. He never smiled except when someone else was in pain. Their journey took them into the highlands, where snow still clung to the bones of the trees. There were no tracks to follow, only stories. A trapper claimed to have seen a woman matching Ruth's description near Elk Pass. Another swore she'd been taken by wolves. Price dismissed them all. He trusted not in chance, but in his own divine guidance and unwavering moral certainty. She bewitched him, Price muttered, almost to himself, as they passed beneath frost-bitten pines. Jacob Galloway was a good, God-fearing man. He tended his land, he tithed to the church. And then she came, red-haired, like the harlot of Babylon, with soft skin and eyes that promised sin. Seth snorted from behind him. "A man hangs himself, Reverend. That ain't witchcraft. That's despair." Price wheeled his horse around, his eyes flashing. "Despair is the gateway to evil. You think Satan comes with horns and brimstone? No, he comes quietly through the whispers of a woman like her." Harlan spit a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Ain't about Satan, Reverend. It's about the land. Jacob owned 15 acres of good soil, prime soil. Now it's just sitting there waiting." Price didn't answer. His fingers, wrapped in black leather gloves, curled tighter around the reins. It was about the land. He wanted it for a new mission school, a place to save the children of the territory. But there was more to it. He knew what the child Ruth carried truly meant. That baby was the last living tie to the Galloway homestead. If he could rescue the girl, raise her in the church, the deed could be shifted, signed, owned. "God will guide us," he said aloud, as if to wash away the greed rising like bile in his throat. "We are his instruments." As they rode, he pictured Ruth, her face pale, dress torn, clinging to the child. But the image was tainted. He wasn't just thinking of saving her. He was thinking of breaking her. He remembered her from town. always strange, soft-spoken, walked barefoot in the grass. Jacob had once told him, in a moment of drunken confession, that she talked to the birds. Price had seen it as a sign of her unholy nature. Now he saw it as proof. She had corrupted a good man. She had driven him to take his own life. The law would call it suicide. Price would call it murder. His hand went to the silver cross around his neck, clutching it not as a prayer, but as a weapon. Because Josiah Price wasn't riding out to save Ruth Galloway. He was riding out to judge her. And in his mind, her child wasn't an innocent soul to be saved. The child was the key to the land, to power, to cleansing the valley of a woman who dared to be different. As they made camp that night, Seth found something in the snow. A small carved wooden bird, no bigger than his thumb. He held it up. "Look at this. Indian work." Price took it. It was new, freshly carved. He crushed it in his fist. "She's not alone," he hissed. The days passed like melted snow finding its way through stone. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of survival became a quiet, sacred routine. Ruth found herself falling into Elias's silence. It no longer unnerved her. In fact, it calmed her more than words ever had. There was no judgment in his eyes, no interrogation in his gaze. He didn't pry about her past or ask about the man she had fled from. His world revolved around simple, profound things, keeping Nellie warm, fed, and alive. And slowly, Ruth realized that in his silence, there was a kind of reverence. He treated life, even a broken life like hers, as something holy. But the silver locket burned in her pocket. The face of the red-haired woman inside was a constant, nagging question. A woman who looked like her, but wasn't her. Who was she? And why did Elias have her picture? She watched him carve wood near the hearth, the blade in his hand slicing through cedar with smooth, practiced strokes. He carved circles within circles, arrows pointing skyward, animals with open mouths and hollow eyes. They weren't just decorations. They were stories. They were memories. One night, as the wind whispered through the chinks in the window frame, she approached him while he worked. She held out the locket. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias stopped carving. He looked at the locket in her palm, and for the first time she saw raw, unguarded pain in his eyes. A pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. He didn't take the locket. He simply looked at it, then at Ruth, then back at the locket. A story was there, a terrible one, but he had no words to tell it. So he did the only thing he could. He picked up a fresh piece of pine and his carving knife. With steady hands, he began to etch a picture into the wood. Not symbols this time, a scene. He carved a cabin, much like this one. He carved a man, a woman with long hair, and a small child. They were holding hands. Then he carved figures on horseback, men with rifles. He carved fire, smoke billowing from the cabin. He carved the man being held down, his face contorted in a silent scream. And then he carved the woman and child, lying still on the ground. When he was finished, he handed the piece of wood to Ruth. Her breath hitched. The woman in the carving, her hair flowing around her still face. She was the woman from the locket, his wife, and his child. "They killed them," Ruth breathed. Elias met her gaze and gave a single, slow nod. His family, murdered. Now she understood the cabin, the collection of bones and feathers. It wasn't just a home, it was a tomb, a memorial. This house was his archive of grief. These pieces spoke for him in ways the world had never allowed. She sat beside him on the floor, the fire casting golden shadows across their faces. The silence was no longer just his. It was theirs, a shared space of sorrow. She reached into her shawl and pulled out a small piece of cloth, her only possession from her past life. Inside was a thimble and a single pearl button. "My mother's," she said, "from Ireland. She was taken, sold." Elias paused, then took the thimble and the button and placed them carefully on the mantel, beside a carved eagle, an offering, an acceptance. They were two broken people, from two different worlds, finding shelter in the same ruin. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. The locket felt heavy in her hand. She looked at Nellie, sleeping peacefully, her cheeks flushed with health. She looked at Elias, sitting by the dying fire, his back to her, a solitary figure carved from shadow and loss. She knew she had to tell him her own truth, not just part of it, all of it. She knelt beside him. "There are things I haven't said," she began. He turned, his eyes patient. "I'm not who they say I am. My mother was an indentured servant from Ireland. She was sold to a railroad foreman. He passed her to another man when she got pregnant with me. They called me half-breed. Not white enough, not anything." She swallowed hard, the words tasting like ash. "At 17, I was sold to Jacob Galloway. He needed a wife. I was convenient. He, he hit me, often, especially after Nellie was born. He said I was making her soft." Her hands clenched the fabric of her dress. "One night, I woke up. He was standing over her crib. He had a pillow in his hands." She blinked fast, refusing to cry. "I didn't think. I just pushed him. He stumbled back, hit his head on the bedpost. He didn't get up again. They say I cursed him, that I'm a witch who fled into the woods. Maybe I am, but I'd do it again. I'd do worse for her." Elias didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly he set down his knife and picked up the piece of wood he'd carved earlier, the one showing the tragedy of his own family. He turned it over. On the clean, smooth back, he began to carve again. Not a picture this time. Letters. He carved slowly, deeply. Then he handed it to her. She held it to the firelight and read the words aloud. "You are not a witch. You are a mother." Just then, a floorboard near the hearth creaked under her knee. It was loose. Curiosity overriding her sorrow, she pulled it up. Tucked in the dark space beneath was a leather satchel. It wasn't Elias's. It was new. And inside was a land deed. The deed to Jacob Galloway's 15 acres. But the name signed at the bottom wasn't Jacob's. It was Reverend Josiah Price, the crunch of hooves on brittle snow. That was the first sound. Ruth froze where she stood by the hearth, a kettle in her hands. Outside, the air had gone sharp with silence, the kind that comes right before violence. She heard them. 3 horses, their breaths steaming in the bitter dusk, circling the cabin. Then came the voice, shrill and laced with venom. "Ruth Galloway, in the name of God, come out!" It was Reverend Price. Ilias was already moving, swift and silent as smoke. He crossed to the wall and pulled down his bow, a long, powerful weapon wrapped in sinew and memory. He kicked open a hidden trap door beneath the table, retrieving a quiver of arrows tipped in stone and bone. No steel, no gunpowder, just ancestral precision. Ruth's hands shook. "They found us!" From outside, Harlan's voice bellowed, thick and ugly. "We know you're in there, Red Elk. Don't make us burn you out." Seth's voice followed, calm and cold as a grave. "Just give us the woman and the baby. This doesn't need to be messy." Ruth clutched Nellie to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. The child stirred but didn't cry, as if the fear was being passed directly from mother to daughter through the skin. Ruth turned to Elias, her eyes wide with panic. "We have to run. Through the back. We can make it to the tree line." Elias didn't even look toward the back of the cabin. He stepped between her and the door, his body a solid, unmoving shield. And then, for the first time in her presence, he spoke. The sound was rough, dry, unused, like stones grinding together. But it carried the force of mountains, the weight of a lifetime of silence. One word. One stone-carved, spine-straightening syllable. "No!" The sound of it stopped her breath. It was more than a word. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the earth. He looked at her, not with rage or panic, but with the deadly certainty of a man who had made his peace with death long ago. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief grounding touch. Then he motioned toward the crawl space under the floorboards where she'd found the satchel. He pointed to Nellie. Ruth hesitated for only a second, then obeyed. She slipped beneath the trap door, pulling the deed with her, settling Nellie against her chest in the cold, dark earth. Through the cracks in the floorboards, she watched Elias move. He was no longer just a man. He was a spirit of vengeance. He dipped a bundle of sage into the fire and waved the smoke toward the windows, the scent filling the small space, cleansing it for what was to come. Outside, heavy boots thudded onto the porch. A crash as a fist hammered against the door. "Last chance, heathen," Price roared. "God commands it." Then silence. A heartbeat later, the window beside the hearth exploded inward as a rock crashed through the glass. Elias didn't flinch. He just stepped back into the shadows, waiting. Harlan kicked the door once, twice. On the third blow, the wood splintered and the door burst open. They stormed in, three dark silhouettes against the dying light, their long shadows dancing like demons in the firelight. Ilias struck first. An arrow flew across the room, a silent hiss of death, burying itself in the wooden post inches from Harlan's head. The second arrow was faster. It landed true, piercing Seth Milner's thigh. He collapsed with a choked howl, clutching at the feathered shaft embedded deep in his leg. Price ducked, pulling his pistol, his face a twisted mask of fury. "Heathen!" he screamed. But Elias was already moving, a phantom slipping through the smoke and shadow. He knocked a lantern from its shelf, oil spilling across the floorboards, creeping toward the fire. Another arrow flew, this one striking Harlan in the shoulder. The big man roared in pain and charged blindly into the room, swinging a heavy crowbar. But Elias had vanished. He knew every beam, every echo, every shadow of this house. He moved like the wind through the trees, emerging behind the intruders to lash out with a blade carved from black obsidian. Seth screamed again as the sharp stone sliced his arm. Harlan swung the crowbar wildly, finally catching Elias in the ribs with a sickening thud that echoed through the small cabin. Ruth heard Elias grunt in pain, and she clutched Nellie tighter, her own breath catching in her throat. Suddenly, the trapdoor was ripped open. Reverend Price loomed over her, his eyes burning with righteous fire. "There you are, harlot," he hissed. He grabbed her arm and dragged her upward, out of the darkness and into the violent chaos of the cabin. He pressed the cold barrel of his gun to her temple. Nellie started to wail, her thin cries cutting through the sounds of the fight. "Drop the bow!" Price screamed at Elias. "Drop it, or the woman dies, and the bastard child with her." Elias emerged from the smoke, bleeding from a cut on his mouth, one eye already swelling shut. He held the bow, his knuckles white. For a moment, everything stood still. Then his hands opened. The bow, his only real weapon, clattered to the floor. "Good," Price sneered, his lips curling back from his teeth. "Now kneel. Kneel before your God." Elias stood his ground, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Price. "Kneel!" Price shrieked. But before he could pull the trigger, Ruth moved. Her free hand, hidden in the folds of her shawl, found the small, bone-handled knife she'd kept since her days at the railroad camp. In one fluid, desperate motion, she twisted in Price's grip and drove the blade deep into his thigh. He screamed, a high, unholy sound of shock and pain. His grip on her loosened for just a fraction of a second. It was all Elias needed. With a cry that sounded like thunder cracking across stone, he surged forward. He tackled the Reverend, sending them both crashing to the ground. Blood sprayed as his fists rained down on Price's face, blow after brutal blow. Price flailed, gasping for air, his eyes wide with terror. Elias grabbed the man's collar, hauling him halfway to his feet. His voice was broken and raw, each word a piece of shrapnel torn from his throat. "She is not yours." He hurled Price across the room. The Reverend hit the far wall with a sickening crack and slumped to the floor, unconscious. The cabin fell silent, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and Seth's pathetic groans. Harlan lay gasping, the arrow still lodged in his shoulder. Ruth stood shaking, Nellie clutched in her arms, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Ilias turned to her. He was covered in blood and ash, his body bruised and broken, but his eyes were clear. She looked at him, not as a savior, not as a silent man, but as a storm forged in centuries of survival. And in her hand, she still held the land deed, splattered now with the Reverend's blood. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof. It was the motive for everything, and it was their only way out. Dawn broke gently, as if the land itself had grown weary of violence. The sky, once bruised with smoke and fear, turned the color of soft gold, casting a pale, clean light over the snow-laced ridges. The storm had passed. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Inside the cabin, a new kind of silence reigned. Not the tense quiet that precedes violence, but a stillness that has been earned. Nellie slept in Ruth's arms, her tiny chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. The floor still bore the dark traces of the fight, but the broken window had been covered with a thick fur pelt. During the night, Elias had tended to the wounded. He had dressed his own bruises and ribs in silence. Then he had dragged the whimpering forms of Seth and Harlan out into the cold, tied them to their own horses, and sent them stumbling back down the mountain. Pinned to Harlan's chest with a skinning knife was the blood-soaked land deed, and scrawled on the back, in crude letters Elias must have carved with charcoal, were two words: "She stays." Reverend Price had not awakened. Ruth didn't ask what Elias had done with him. There are some forms of justice that don't need words, some darkness that is best left buried deep in the winter earth. She didn't want to know. Instead, as the first light touched the treetops, Elias nudged her shoulder. She looked up, blurry-eyed but present. He held out a hand. "Come," he rasped, the words still foreign on his tongue. She followed him outside, her boots crunching over the softened crust of snow. The wind was gentle now, brushing against her cheek like a promise. Elias led her past the shed, past the smokehouse to the back of the property, where the land curved gently downward into a hollowed stretch of soil. A garden. No one would have known it was there from the front. But here, tucked away and sheltered by the trees, Elias had been tending rows of dark, rich earth for years. The ground had been turned and layered with ash and mulch, protected from the worst of the snow. Now, with spring beginning to stretch its limbs beneath the surface, the soil seemed to exhale warmth. He handed her a pouch made of hide. It was filled with kernels of dried corn, carefully selected, each one golden and whole. She took it with a reverence she hadn't known she possessed. Side by side, they knelt in the dirt. Elias showed her how to place each kernel, 2 finger lengths deep, spaced like stars in a sky only he could read. Her hands trembled at first, still scraped and stained from the night before, but she steadied them. They planted in a comfortable shared silence, one row then another. The simple, repetitive motion became a prayer. The last time she had begged for cornmeal, it had been for survival. This time, it was for a future. When they finished the last row, Elias stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked out toward the horizon. Ruth remained kneeling for a moment longer, her palms pressed flat against the cool earth. She could feel Nellie's steady heartbeat against her chest, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the waking ground beneath her. Life was returning, not just to the land, but to her. Later that morning, as the sun rose higher, Elias returned to the cabin and began to carve. The familiar, clean scent of cedar shavings filled the small room. Ruth sat nearby, rocking Nellie, watching his hands. They moved with a purpose she now understood, speaking a language all their own. His blade traced deep, meaningful lines into a piece of smooth driftwood he must have saved for years, for a special occasion. When he was done, he sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone, ran his hand along its edge, and placed it on the mantel above the fire, right next to her mother's thimble and button. Ruth walked over to it, her heart thudding in her chest. The words he had carved were simple, but they rang with the kind of truth that can only be forged in fire. Family is not what you are born into. It is who you would bleed for. Her throat tightened. She reached up and touched the letters. Each groove was a wound that had been healed by choice. Outside, the day stretched long and soft. The snow receded inch by inch, giving way to the dark, damp soil of a new season. A few chickens scratched hesitantly near the edge of the barn. A single hawk circled high above the pines, a silent, watchful guardian. Ruth stood on the porch, Nellie bundled and asleep in her arms. The baby's lips moved slightly, chasing dream milk. Ruth adjusted the shawl around her daughter's body and glanced toward the side yard. Elias sat on a stump near the woodpile, sharpening his axe with steady practiced strokes. The rhythmic rasp of the whetstone on steel was the only sound in the vast, quiet world. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew she was there. She stepped down the stairs slowly, letting her boots find their footing in the new mud. The earth was waking up, and so was her heart. When she reached him, she didn't speak. She simply sat down on the log beside him, and he, without breaking his rhythm, reached into his coat, pulled out a second, smaller whetstone, and placed it on the log between them. An invitation, a beginning. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. They didn't need anything more than this. No more running, no more hiding, only staying, only building, only seeing. And in the quiet cradle of a land once marked by ash and blood, they chose to plant a home, something no one had ever given them freely. The story of what happened to Reverend Price became a whispered legend in Dry Creek, a cautionary tale about a man of God who went into the mountains chasing a demon and was never seen again. Harlan and Seth returned, broken and terrified, speaking of a silent Apache warrior who moved like a ghost and fought like a force of nature. They never rode into the highlands again. The Galloway land, with its deed now evidence in the hands of the territorial marshal, was left fallow. But high up in the mountains, a new family took root. A woman who found her strength, a man who found his voice, and a little girl who would grow up knowing that home isn't a place you find, but a place you make. And sometimes the most powerful words are the ones spoken in silence. What do you think happened to the town of Dry Creek after its corrupt leader vanished? Let me know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of survival and the wild, untamed West.